You're listening to Beyond the Endpoint, a podcast from the Duke Clinical Research Institute. In this series, we're demystifying clinical research and answering your pressing questions about health and healthcare. You can find our full episodes at dcri.org/BTE.
We're back with episode 2 of our series we're calling Beyond the Headlines, where we break down some recent health and research news and explore what's beyond the buzz. In this episode, we're taking a closer look at headlines spanning nutrition and wellness, autism, and a new potential obesity treatment. I'm Manesh Patel, and I'm joined with my co-host, Emily O'Brien.
Thanks so much, Manesh. We have a ton of fascinating headlines to get to today, so let's jump in. All right, first one. How many grams of protein do you consume every day?
I wish I knew how many I consume, but I do think there's been a lot of dietary conversation about how many people have to have or should have. I'll say I'm in the camp of thinking that protein is generally a good nutrient. They're macronutrients, right? And a lot of people have said, oh, the fact that I'm saying you should have a reasonable amount of protein means that I'm totally anti-carb. No, but I do tell my patients that I think the proper diet, at least cardiovascularly, is thought to be some version of the Mediterranean diet of vegetables, fruits, and a reasonable amount of lean proteins. And of course, you can have some carbs, but those are sort of the drivers.
So if you were to go on TikTok today, I think you would see, well, you see a lot of things, but one of the things I think you would see is evidence of what we are now calling a protein craze. It's gotten pretty ridiculous. And some people are calling it a protein panic because of how sort of off the rails we've gone with this. You also see evidence in a grocery store. There's like protein cereal, protein cookies, even protein water, which like maybe you can go back to your biochemistry days as a med student and tell us if that makes like absolutely any sense at all. It doesn't to me. But the article that we are going to talk about first is one from the New York Times. And this one was actually pretty well done. And I was like, wow, like for like a sort of lay summary of the science, whoever wrote this like really crushed it. And then I find out that it's a reporter who has a PhD in nutrition. So like no surprise that she did a good job. The headline for this one is "The more protein, the better," with a question mark. So this is like a simple question with lots of different layers. So we're going to kind of get into the layers. And I want to make this a little more interactive with you and not just, give a lecture. So here's what I want to do. I'm going to tell you the claims that the article tackles. And like I said, I thought they did a pretty good job of like getting into the data. You just tell me like whether this is a claim that you think would sort of fly in your practice, that like somebody brought this to you, you'd say like, oh yeah, like that makes sense. Or if it's something that you'd really want to debunk.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's do it.
So the first one is that the federal recommendations for protein are a joke. And that is actually a quote from, unfortunately, one of my favorite clinicians who is very much in the public eye. And I really like his work, even on TikTok and social media. But he thinks that basically that recommendation is way too low. So what's your take?
Here's the thing on protein. I think here he's right. I think the federal recommendation, which is less than 1 gram per kilogram of body weight, is wrong. Now, the key is, I think protein in general is important. And as a cardiologist, I'll just say, I think lean protein is better. I think every individual gets to make a decision there. Somebody that's getting 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, I think that's reasonable compared to the US current recommendation that's like, less than that.
Wow. I think you basically nailed it. The take here, at least from the New York Times research, is that, there's a difference. There's like this distinction between the recommended daily allowance and like optimal intake, and that there's like certainly going to be some variation around the optimal intake. And like that recommendation was always intended to be like a minimum to prevent muscle deficiency, right? So their conclusion is like, this is adequate, but it might not be like the ideal level for the average person. So you might think of it like sleep, like getting the minimum amount to survive, but to thrive, you may actually need a little bit more. So let's talk about the second claim, which is that most Americans aren't getting enough protein. So this is more like my world, like population health. But what do you think? Are we getting enough?
This is sort of the way I think about this now. I tell my patients this too. If you have a plate, a circular plate, and you were looking at it like a clock, I tell a lot of them between 12 and 6, I want vegetables. And from 6 to 9 or 10, I want protein. And it's only that little spot between 10 or 11 and noon that I want the carbs. But what's actually in most Americans' plate is from 12 to 6 carb and a lot less vegetable, and then maybe some protein. So when we say people aren't getting enough protein, it's not that they're not getting enough nutrition most of the time, although there are unfortunately people who don't have enough nutrition in our country and worldwide. It's that they're getting, I think, unfortunately, the wrong kind of maybe ultra processed or carbs or other things, whereas they could get healthy fruit and vegetables if they can get access to it, and protein, that would be better.
Well, that is consistent with what the evidence shows, at least according to this article, which seems reasonable. So again, comes back to this concept of like, what's like recommended versus optimal. And like, according to the RDA thresholds, technically most of us are getting enough protein. And I took a look at the study that was cited there, and it's from an NHANES 24-hour recall-based study, which is actually a bit better for measuring population intake than like a food frequency questionnaire, which has some, I think, well-known validity issues. But, I think some of the drama around this is that there are some subgroups that tend to be at higher risk, either because of kidney issues or maybe people who are more restrictive with eating patterns. And that's where some of the concern around, hey, we're not doing well enough on this kind of comes into play. So let's talk about one of those. And this is a specific claim that older adults need more protein. What's your take on that?
So I think as people age, I think one of the things I think a lot about is how we not just have them eat protein, but have them do activities and exercises that, again, are somewhat helpful in building muscle mass. And so even in a cardiovascular clinic, we talk a lot about what that, I guess, aging and performance and healthy aging is. A lot of that where it's weight bearing or some sort of exercise which helps with muscle. And ideally, if they can do it without hurting their joints, it's really valuable. So I do recommend that people try to do as they age more exercises that keep muscle mass, and exercises that do muscle mass require you to have at least some level of protein intake. The other things is all of these things, I don't have to tell you this, they're confounded by these observations of people as they age because they don't eat enough protein. Well, they may have other medical problems. They may have other issues. And so, I look at my mother who's not eating enough, I'll say protein, but she's got other reasons she's not eating protein as much. And we can try to get her to eat more protein, but that's just a bigger thing in life. So
that actually touches on one of the points that I had about a study included in the New York Times article. They pointed to this observational study that basically showed that in older women, eating 50% more protein was associated with less frailty over time. And so, again, you start to wonder about what kind of people are the ones who are eating 50% more protein relative to some baseline. And I think it's difficult to know without, spending a lot of time in the data, whether the adjustment was sufficient. But in general, the recommendations are still there for older folks. And actually, I didn't know this, European guidelines already recommend higher intakes for seniors than US guidelines. So
you've been quizzing me, so maybe I'll get you a headline. There's a Fox News story on anti-aging benefits linked to one surprising health habit. And the health habit they talk about is meditation. They report that it may extend longevity, reduce stress. This one I thought, when I read the headline, I thought of you, because I know in one of our other episodes you were talking about, doing some meditation. And as I read through the article, I thought, like a lot of these articles, there's some really interesting kind of claims and findings. First is that they do cite a study where people silently repeated a mantra in their head to achieve deep relaxation, and that reduced their stress. I guess I'll start by asking you, what are your thoughts on, I'll call it, whether it's regular meditation or transcendental meditation, and how do you think about it for yourself? And then what do you think about the science around it?
Yeah, well, it's very sad to think about my failed meditation attempts in the past and the association between meditation and aging, because I think I'm going to have to increase my Botox budget with time. But aside from that, from what I can tell, meditation is one of the best evidence-based approaches that we have for non-pharmacologic management of some common mental health issues like anxiety and depression. I think many people who have participated in clinical trials to produce those data over time are likely to fall off, as many of us do, without some sort of incentive or like ongoing commitment to something like a study to keep us going. So I feel like we're at a point now where it's kind of like eating your 5 to 9 servings of vegetables a day, where that this is something that will benefit your health. The evidence is pretty uncontroversial, but The challenge is like the implementation. Like, how do I actually implement this in my life and commit to it in a way that acknowledges that it does take some effort and it's not comfortable. And it's, part of the benefit, I think, is embracing that discomfort and like learning to sit there when like you want to think about a million other things or get up and do something you need to get done.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful. I mean, I think that the concept is important. And what was really good about this study, I think, is that they did have two groups of participants, one group ranging from like 20 to 30 years of age and another in their 50s, like 55 to 72. And half of them followed this sort of transcendental meditation and the control group did not. And then they actually analyzed expressions of, I'll say, some genes that are associated to inflammation and aging, some potential, I'll call it surrogate markers. And what's really interesting is that there is this link, whether it's meditation or our environment or other exposures or stress, where, even though our genes don't change, we turn them on and off, and how we might have inflammation turn on and off is really affecting. The researchers, interestingly, also did EEG tests. That's like where they put the pads or the stickers on your head and they're looking at your brain waves. And they did that during the study too, which is, I thought, important to say, like, what happened? Did the people really slow down their processes? My take on this was that they tried to do a lot of testing in different places to understand meditation. Again, trying to be, directly scientific about this. I think there's great evidence that people who do meditation seem to do better. It's one of the observed things in these blue zones where people seem to live really long and do well with eating and doing things like that. But I don't know how you get, to your point, people who haven't been doing it to do it, to stick to it. It's low risk and it's not like expensive. So those two things actually make me think, like, if nothing else, I should be recommending it. But I guess that's sort of what you were saying, huh?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is one where like the observational versus randomized design has some, I think, real saliency, because anytime you bring up meditation at like a, cocktail party or something, inevitably someone who's like, let's just say more on the high strung end of the spectrum is like, I can never meditate. It's like way too boring and I have way too much to do. And you kind of look at them and you're like, you might be the one that actually really would benefit from this. So yeah, I'm fully in favor of more randomized designs.
This is Beyond the Endpoint, a podcast where we bring personal and expert perspectives on healthcare and clinical research to the casual listener. Stay tuned after the interview for a breakdown with the hosts. They'll talk through key takeaways and what this week's topic means for you.
So far, we've covered protein in your diet. A little bit more is probably not bad. And we talked about meditation. But if we're talking about headlines, I guess the next big headline for you and me, and certainly for you to be thinking about, I'd be interested in your take, is this New York Times story that reported again in the last week or two that the autism rate continues to rise among children. The CDC reported, and Robert F. Kennedy called it an epidemic. And obviously there's a lot of conversation between the cause, the association. I wanted to get your thoughts on this as somebody who thinks about these things a lot.
Right. So I'm first going to start with a deep breath just to center myself before this discussion. But yes, so this is another New York Times article that was really well done, and I think took a nice and balanced approach to this very high profile, let's just call it that, high profile and controversial topic. The headline is Autism Rates Continue to Rise Among Children, and CDC reports. So this is a report from the CDC. They have some new data showing that 1 in 31 kids, specifically 8-year-olds, were estimated to have autism. So these are 2022 data, and that's a slight increase from 1 in 36 just 2 years earlier. And that's about 5 times what it was in 2000. So like the obvious question, and the reason that epidemiologists get out of bed in the morning is, what is happening here? Is this due to better recognition? Is it due to differences in access? Is this really an epidemic, the way that it's been framed by some of the leaders in health-related positions in the federal government? But the spoiler to all of this, of course, is that we know certainly that it is not vaccines. So we can talk more about that. But the data are, super strong data from the CDC. It's from the data from their Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network. The records came from about 270,000 children in 16 different locations across the US. And so they still saw like a ton of variation in prevalence across states, from like over 5% in California to under 1% in Texas. So that's sort of like the first point that kind of makes me focus on things like access and screening and services, and ask questions about how geographic differences in availability of those resources may actually contribute to some of the state level variation. So when you see a headline like this, like, do you feel like you have a pretty good sense of what parts of it are real and valid, and what components might be a little bit overblown, or let's just say a little less data driven?
So first, I think it's very, very important and valuable to recognize that it is really important that we get to standard ways we think about it and standard ways we measure it, so that you and me and others can really get to the bottom of at least what's going on with the rates. I think the rate issue is an important one because the rate issue is going up. It is at least being diagnosed, recognized, even with the same data, maybe the rates are going up. So that's an important piece, because I think that's the first important feature we should discuss. And then after that, I think it's important that people realize that autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, as they say in the article, and it's characterized by difficulties, and it's a spectrum of difficulties, from interactions to communications to sensory issues and repetitive sort of interests and behaviors that the kids or adults might not be able to do. And so it's really important, and a lot of families are figuring out how to care for loved ones and helping with that. The cause is unknown. There's probably a significant genetic component when you just look at families that have it, or at least some historic things there. The associations that people have had to the causality, this is a classic case where people really want to talk about that. And I think our country is going to have conversations for the next several months about. And there, I think what we can do the best we can is to say, here are the principles of what the scientific ways in which we think about that beyond the headline, or even beyond the endpoint, which is, unfortunately, in something like autism, it's really complicated because there's so many possible exposures. There's so many possible things going on. And when you don't know the underlying cause of a disorder, then we have to start trying to tease that out. And that's why somebody like yourself as an epidemiologist or somebody else is really deeply thinking about that. Now, there have been really well done large number of studies to discuss this, which they don't go into actually in the article, which is interesting. I think the article is understanding and importantly just saying, look, the rate's going up and there needs to be a conversation, which I think is probably where we should stay with this conversation right now. Because I think as we get to the next set of conversations that are going to happen in our country, as people start to talk about, is there causality versus association, then we should get all that data out and have maybe even a whole episode on it. Because right now, what we do know is that the rates, at least that we're observing, are going up.
To me, the challenge is making that discussion meaningful to people who, don't spend all day talking about things like causality and confounding without oversimplifying it, right? So you mentioned all the different causes. The expert consensus is that, contrary to what seems to be the perspective of, some of our new leadership, there isn't one sort of smoking gun, so to speak, here, right? This is a very complicated epidemiological topic. And, we're not just talking about detection differences over time or access differences. We're also talking about a condition that we're certain is not the result of just one exposure or just one gene, but a combination of different things. And so if I had to say or give one piece of advice to people who are kind of watching the progress in this space and what's going to be happening over the next couple of months, which we'll get to, I would say welcome the complexity and be willing to kind of deal with some messiness, because it's not straightforward. If it were, we wouldn't still be asking these questions. And actually, in some ways, the availability of additional types of data and the methodological rigor that we can apply to these complex data sets is at, I think, a really good point to begin like really uncovering a lot about this. So I don't want to say that we haven't done it right so far. I think there's been like incredible progress, but certainly, a lot of really smart people who have some great ideas about how to go forward from here.
I just want us to make sure we apply all the best scientific rigor we can. A lot of great work's happened. And I think what we're going to have to do is put what happens in context of the existing work. And as you said, deal with the messiness, because there are no perfect ways to answer some of these questions.
So Manesh, tell me your reaction as someone who's been in clinical research for a while when you hear something like, we're going to find out the cause of this thing by September.
Yeah, there I worry. And I know that was a statement that obviously was made. I say that just because I think I do want to really work hard at finding answers to medical problems. But the timelines on that's pretty specific, and I want to make sure that we're giving enough time for people that are trying to get to the answers and using all the available data.
Right. And also being careful about using, I think, stigmatizing language in the way that we talk about this, right? Like maybe we shouldn't really be thinking about this as a preventable disease or, something that ruins everyone's life if you receive this diagnosis, but also point to really the variation in presentation and how it's really our job to think about what kinds of accommodations we can make for people who are on the spectrum and to thoughtfully partner with them to figure out more about, what the determinants are and what improves outcomes over time.
For sure. Last story. Should we go on to our last story?
Yes, let's do it. We are now in GLP-1 land. Can't leave a headline episode without something about GLPs. Some new data from Lilly. Tell us about this new phase 3 trial.
So the story is from NBC News, and it's Lilly says a daily pill can lower blood sugar and weight in people with type 2 diabetes. Lilly is the maker of tirzepatide, one of the injectable GLP-1 receptor agonists, reminding everyone that this is a glucagon-like receptor agonist. This is a protein that goes from your gut to your brain and potentially tells your brain all kinds of things, but importantly might tell your brain that you've had enough to eat or you feel satiated. And those therapeutics actually not just have shown weight loss, but they've shown in randomized trials improved cardiovascular outcomes, but also reduction in the number of people going on to develop diabetes when they're pre-diabetic and a variety of other endpoints, including now sleep apnea and some others. This is a daily pill now, not an injectable from Lilly, that they just reported the results of a study, importantly, a phase 3 study, and I think it's called orforglipron. It lowered A1C levels by 1.6% after 40 weeks compared to placebo. Remind everyone that the hemoglobin A1C is a marker of your sugar control. The full results of the trial, I suspect, are going to be presented at the American Diabetes Association and published hopefully at the same time.
One of the things that we saw with Ozempic and that we're actually still continuing to see for some populations is a pretty big issue with access. So what do you know about this mode of administration versus like an injection? Do you think that this is likely to ease some of the pains that we've seen in terms of people actually being able to get this drug when they're prescribed?
The best thing I can say about this is we want more therapeutics in the market because hopefully competition helps us both with price and access to our patients, which I think is getting better, and more evidence that these therapeutics, in addition to weight loss, help us with sugar or diabetes management and then help us with our clinical outcomes. So what's encouraging about this is that there's now, for people who may not always want injectables, a pill. The pill has, at least in phase 3 studies, shown to not only reduce A1C, which is similar to what we've seen in some of the injectables that you highlighted, but also weight reduction in the average of 9 to 15% at 36 weeks. So depending on the dose, I think that's right. We'll have to get all the trial data out because, some of these therapeutics orally, they sometimes have drug-drug interactions and others. So we're going to want to see all the safety data. The class as general, at least in the injectable format, has seemed to be pretty safe and been on the market for a while now with people using it. But the biggest thing I think for this and other discoveries in our clinical practice is how do we get it to the people that most need it? And I think to your point, having another therapeutic on the market is going to be really important for us because it allows us to have hopefully more access for patients and better ways to have, I'll call it insurance coverage for these therapeutics for our patients.
And better evidence than protein water for weight loss.
Well, when you're trying to get gains every day, you got to do what you got to do. You got to work out at 4:30 and put your head in some ice water and get some protein water and then get a sauna, a little bit of meditation and get your oral GLP-1.
I mean, it is prom season after all. So, you can't be too prepared.
You're right. Listen, I think we make fun of it. We enjoy talking to each other, but these headlines do hopefully give people some perspective and context. We're just welcoming the ability to have the conversation because I think the more we can inform each other, the better we can take care of ourselves and hopefully have better health.
Thanks so much to our listeners for joining us today for this episode of Beyond the Endpoint. If you have headlines or ideas that you'd like us to discuss, please email us at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu.
Yeah, it was really fun. And thanks so much, Emily, for going through the headlines with me. Thank you all for listening, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode.
This has been Beyond the Endpoint. Resources related to this episode are available on dcri.org/BTE. If you have any burning questions about clinical research or healthcare, drop us a line at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu. We'd love to address your questions in a future episode.